The cold of that night in Manhattan didn't match the excessive glint emanating from the glass-fronted restaurants. The city continued its indifferent course, as always, swallowing up those who couldn't keep up with the pace. On the sidewalk of West 57th Street, between a five-star hotel and a closed jewelry store, a young woman sat on a crumpled piece of cardboard, trying to protect herself from the wind with a coat that no longer served its purpose. She didn't look a day over 20. Her face was grimy, not from neglect, but from days spent without access to hot water, mirrors, or true rest. Her brown hair, once probably beautiful, was haphazardly tied back, and her watchful eyes followed every person who passed. She hadn't asked aloud. There was no sign, just silent observation and calculation. She had learned early on that in that city, drawing too much attention was as dangerous as not existing at all. Across the street, a black sedan stopped smoothly in front of the illuminated entrance of the area's most exclusive restaurant. The driver got out first, opened the rear door with practiced precision, and a man stepped out, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. Everything about him indicated control: erect posture, firm steps, a gaze that swept across the room without lingering on irrelevant details. He was someone accustomed to being recognized, even when not directly approached. Daniel Whitmore was a well-known name in the financial world, an investor, owner of real estate funds, and a frequent presence at closed events where decisions were made away from the general public. In his early 40s, he had built a fortune that guaranteed him absolute comfort and a routine protected from any unforeseen event. The city, for him, was a predictable chessboard, where each piece occupied its correct place. Upon entering the restaurant, Daniel didn't notice the young woman on the sidewalk, but she noticed everything. The car, the expensive suit, the way the restaurant's security guard made an almost imperceptible gesture of recognition. She knew how to identify those in power. She had learned this by observing, making mistakes, and surviving. And that night, hunger spoke louder than fear. She waited. Time passed differently inside the restaurant. Glasses clinked, restrained laughter filled the air, and elaborate dishes were served with surgical precision. Daniel chatted with two associates about numbers, acquisitions, and deadlines. The food was excellent, but he barely noticed. For him, meals of that kind had become part of the scenery, not an experience. When he finally got out, it was already past 10 o'clock at night. The cold seemed more intense, and the street was less busy. The driver started ahead, but Daniel gestured for him to wait. I liked to walk a few meters before getting into the car. I told myself that it kept me connected to the real city, although I rarely looked beyond my own reflection in the shop windows. That's when he heard the voice. "Sir, excuse me." It wasn't an aggressive tone, nor was it pleading. It was direct, restrained, almost embarrassed by its very existence. Daniel turned, uneasy at the unexpected breaking of his bubble. He saw the young woman slowly rise from the sidewalk, keeping a certain distance, as if she knew that any misstep could be interpreted as a threat. "I don't want money," she said quickly before he could react. "I just wanted to know if you're going to throw away what's left of the dinner." The phrase caught him off guard. It wasn't a typical request. There was no rehearsed speech, no sad story spilled out in seconds, just a stark observation of reality. Daniel instinctively looked around, as if searching for someone to handle it for him. He found no one. The driver waited a few meters ahead, attentive but motionless. "The leftovers," he repeated, more out of reflex than curiosity. "Yes," she replied, keeping her eyes downcast. "I saw you go in. I know those places throw away good food. I'm just hungry." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. For Daniel, this situation was unlike any scenario he was used to managing. He made donations, funded social projects, signed checks at charity events, all of this remotely. Here, however, was a real person, smelling of the streets, with a chill in their bones and an immediate need that could not be outsourced. He felt an automatic urge to refuse, to get in the car and drive home. It would be the easiest, safest, most familiar way, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps the fact that she hadn't asked for money. Perhaps her restrained gaze, without exaggerated expectations. Or perhaps it was just the growing unease of realizing how disconnected his life had become from what was happening just a few meters away. "Wait here," he said, in a tone that sounded firmer than he intended. He went back into the restaurant, ignoring the maitre d's confused look. Minutes later, he came out with a discreet, tightly closed bag. He approached the young woman and handed her the package without ceremony. She received the bag carefully, as if it were something fragile. She didn't open it immediately. She just held it, feeling its weight, the warmth that was still there. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but firm. "Really?" Daniel nodded, already taking a half step back, ready to end the interaction. But before he could walk away, she spoke again. "You know that this doesn't change anything, right?" He stopped. "Like this?" She looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze directly. There was something there that didn't match the image he had created of her. It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. "I'll be here again tomorrow, and the day after that too. The hunger returns quickly." Daniel didn't answer, not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in a long time, he realized he didn't fully understand the game he thought he had mastered. He got into the car in silence, while the young woman sat back down on the sidewalk, now with the bag close to her body. The sedan drove away, blending into the night traffic. But the scene stayed with him, persistent, breaking the comfortable order of his routine. Something had been displaced, a detail too small to justify unease and too big to be ignored. The city woke up early, but not everyone awoke with the same urgency. For Daniel Whitmore, mornings began with the controlled silence of an apartment on the Upper East Side, where every object seemed to exist only to fulfill its function. The large windows offered a privileged view of Central Park, still shrouded in mist, while the automatic coffee maker did its job without demanding attention. Everything there was efficient, predictable, immune to surprises. He dressed with the precision of someone who had repeated the same ritual for years. Shirts aligned by shade, suits chosen according to predefined commitments, expensive watches that marked not only the time, but a silent hierarchy. Daniel didn't need to think much about his choices. His life had been built to function on autopilot. On the other side of town, the awakening was abrupt. The young woman from the previous night opened her eyes with a start when a sanitation worker passed by pushing a noisy cart. She had slept poorly, as was almost always the case, huddled under the awning of a closed shop, using her backpack as a pillow. The food bag, now empty, was carefully folded and tucked away among her few belongings. She wasted nothing, not even memories. Her name was Maya. Not her birth name, but the one she adopted after realizing that real names created dangerous ties. She had come from a Midwestern state years before, fleeing a home where promises were always accompanied by violence. New York had emerged as an abstract idea of a fresh start, but quickly revealed itself to be a city that exacted a high price for any chance. Maya knew the streets like someone reading an invisible map. She knew which blocks were safer at night, which doors remained open for too long, which glances should be avoided. There were unwritten rules among those who lived on the margins, and she had learned to respect them in order to keep breathing. That morning, she walked to a makeshift shelter near 8th Avenue, where volunteers were handing out weak coffee and stale bread. She took just enough to avoid drawing attention. Remaining invisible for her was a way of surviving. Still, her mind kept returning to the previous night, not because of the food, but because of the man's reaction. He hadn't treated her with disdain, nor with exaggerated pity. He had just seemed out of place. Daniel, for his part, was trying to regain control of his own routine. In the office, located in a mirrored building in the financial district, Meetings followed one another without long breaks. Advisors presented reports, numbers appeared on screens, decisions were made quickly. It was the environment where he felt competent, where everything obeyed the logic of measurable gain and loss. Even so, at short intervals, the image of the young woman would appear without warning, not as guilt, but as a question without a clear answer. That phrase, "hunger returns quickly," echoed uncomfortably. He had heard much more elaborate speeches about poverty and inequality, but none had been as direct as that one. As he went out for lunch, Daniel chose to walk, something he rarely did outside of strategic times. The movement of the streets seemed different in the daylight. Hurried people, street vendors, confused tourists. In the midst of the crowd, he began to notice figures he had previously simply ignored. Bodies leaning against walls, overly attentive gazes, hands outstretched in a restrained manner. The city had always been there, he just couldn't see it. Maya spent the afternoon moving between familiar spots. She avoided staying in one place for too long. Experience had taught her that consistency attracted trouble. Still, as night fell, her steps led her back to West 57th Street. Not out of hope, but out of logic. Expensive restaurants meant waste, and waste sometimes meant dinner. She positioned herself in the same spot as the night before, without sitting down immediately. She observed the movement, recognized patterns, assessed risks. She saw luxury cars arrive and depart, well-dressed people laughing loudly, attentive security guards. And for a moment she thought she wouldn't see him again. Daniel arrived later that time. The same sedan, the same driver, but something about his demeanor was different. He didn't go straight into the restaurant. He stopped for a moment, observing the street. His eyes scanned the sidewalk until they met Maya's. There was no surprise, just recognition. She noticed his gaze and felt her body stiffen. She didn't like being noticed by those in power. Still, she didn't move. She didn't ask for anything. She waited. They didn't speak that night. Daniel went into the restaurant and came out sometime later, leaving a bag near the sidewalk, without looking directly at her. Maya picked up the package after the car had already left. It wasn't ordinary charity. It was a silent, almost uncomfortable gesture. The repetition began there. Over the following weeks, that discreet interaction became part of the landscape. No promises, no excessive words. Daniel would leave something. Maya would take it. Two worlds, touching just enough not to crumble. But in a city built on contrasts, nothing remained stable for long, and they were both beginning to realize that this fragile routine was about to be tested. The regularity of that silent exchange began to generate consequences that neither of them had foreseen. In a city where everything was observed, even the most discreet gestures ended up being noticed. And New York, despite its vastness, had a habit of shrinking when least expected. Daniel started arriving at the restaurant earlier, altering his schedule to accommodate this informal routine that would never have appeared on his agenda. He didn't tell anyone. The driver simply followed instructions, although he showed some discomfort with the prolonged stops. For Daniel, that pause had become a strange point of tension in the day, not because of the risk, but because of the growing feeling that something was escaping his usual control. In the office, small flaws began to surface. He would interrupt meetings to check his watch, miss details that had previously not escaped him, and display unusual impatience. His partners noticed. One of them, Richard Hale, a pragmatic man attentive to any sign of instability, began to observe Daniel more closely. "You seem distracted," he remarked one afternoon while they were reviewing an important contract. "That's unusual for you." Daniel looked away, pretending to review a document. Just exhaustion. Richard didn't insist, but the doubt remained. In the world they both moved in, distraction was synonymous with vulnerability. And vulnerabilities, sooner or later, were exploited. Maya was also facing changes. The frequency with which she appeared on the same block began to bother other homeless people. An older man, known only as Frank, directly warned her about it. "People like you can't afford to be predictable," he said, watching the street activity. "Someone will always think you're taking advantage." She nodded, but didn't answer. She knew he was right. Still, the cold logic of survival clashed with something new, a silent expectation. Not for the man himself, but for the feeling that, for a few minutes, she wasn't completely ignored. Tensions rose when one night ended differently. Daniel left the restaurant earlier than usual. The atmosphere was heavy, a light rain was falling, and the street was almost empty. Looking for where he usually left his bag, he noticed Maya wasn't there. He glanced around uncomfortably, as if he'd missed an important appointment without knowing exactly why. Minutes later, he saw two security guards from the neighboring building talking sharply to someone on the corner. He approached close enough to understand the tone without being noticed. He recognized Maya immediately. She kept her arms close to her body, in a defensive posture, while one of the men pointed to the street. "We've told you to leave before," the security guard said. "The residents are complaining." She tried to argue, but her voice was lost in the noise of the rain. Daniel felt a sudden urge to intervene, something that went against all his instincts for social self-preservation. Still, he stepped forward. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, in a controlled but firm tone. The security guards turned around, surprised to recognize who was speaking. The expensive suit, the visible watch, the confident posture. The treatment changed immediately. "Sir, we were simply asking her to leave. Orders from the building." Daniel looked at Maya, who kept her gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't ask anything. He simply replied, "She's with me." The phrase hung in the air, laden with implications he himself hadn't fully considered. The security guards hesitated for a moment and, without arguing, retreated. Maya remained motionless, as if unsure if it was real. Daniel said nothing more. He walked to his usual spot, put the bag down, and walked away. Only then did he realize the weight of his own choice. He hadn't just helped someone, he had exposed himself. He had created a visible association. The next day, the consequences began to emerge. An anonymous email arrived in Richard Hale's inbox. Short, direct, accompanied by a photo taken from a distance. Daniel standing on the sidewalk, with Maya in the background. The message made no explicit accusations, but insinuated behavior inappropriate for someone in his position. In the corporate world, insinuations were enough to generate noise. Richard called Daniel aside for a private conversation. "I need to know if there's something I should be worried about," she said, showing the photo. "Because if this gets around, it'll become a hot topic, and a hot topic becomes a problem." Daniel felt irritation rising, mixed with something close to shame, not for helping someone, but for realizing how that simple gesture could be distorted. "There's nothing inappropriate about it," he replied, "just someone who's hungry." Richard held the gaze for a few seconds. People don't want explanations, they want narratives, and someone is already trying to construct one. Meanwhile, Maya was facing her own inner conflicts. Daniel's intervention had not gone unnoticed among those living on the street. Some began to avoid her. Others looked at her with suspicion. The momentary protection came with isolation. That night, when Daniel left the bag, Maya didn't approach immediately. She watched from a distance, assessing the risks. When she finally picked up the package, she didn't feel relief. She felt fear. Something that had begun as a simple gesture was turning into a minefield, and both of them, coming from opposite worlds, were beginning to realize that this unlikely connection had a cost they couldn't yet calculate. From the moment that photo began circulating silently, parallel forces began to move without Daniel being fully aware of it. The corporate world in which he operated functioned like a sensitive machine. Any misalignment generated noise, and noise attracted unwanted attention. Richard Hale wasn't the only one observing. Ellen Brooks, a communications advisor for the investment fund, received veiled comments from financial journalists she was in contact with. They weren't direct questions, but suggestions disguised as curiosity. Whether Daniel was involved in some kind of personal social project, whether there was a change of focus, whether his public image would undergo repositioning. Ellen brought the matter up with Daniel in a straightforward manner. "Someone is trying to tell a story for you," she said, sitting down opposite him bluntly. "And if we do nothing, that story will grow on its own." Daniel listened in silence. He didn't like the idea of turning a human gesture into an image strategy. Still, he understood the rules of the game. Denying everything seemed suspicious. Assuming something that didn't exist would be worse. "There's no story," he replied. "Just a person going hungry." "For you, yes," Ellen replied. "For the audience, it's never just that." Meanwhile, another subplot was unfolding far from the glass-walled rooms. Maya began to realize that her stay in that area was becoming unsustainable. Besides the growing hostility from other homeless people, different approaches emerged. A middle-aged man, too well-dressed for the time and place, began to observe her from afar on some nights. He never spoke. He just looked, wrote something on his cell phone, and disappeared. Time pressure was cruelly imposing itself. Winter was approaching, and the shelters were becoming increasingly crowded. Securing a spot required strict schedules and submission to rules that Maya avoided, not out of rebellion, but because of past experiences that had taught her to distrust enclosed spaces. An opportunity arose in an ambiguous way. Frank, the man who had warned her weeks before, approached her with a proposal. "There are people offering work," he said in a low voice. "Nothing clean, but it pays enough to get off the streets." Maya didn't need to ask for details. She knew the kind of work that usually entailed. She refused without hesitation, but the refusal was also a choice that further narrowed her options. On Daniel's side, the conflict branched out within his own home. His younger sister, Claire, visited him one evening. A teacher at a public school in the Bronx, she had always been the unspoken moral compass of the family. Unlike Daniel, she had chosen a path far removed from large sums of money and controlled environments. During dinner, the subject inevitably came up. "They're talking about you," she said bluntly. "Not officially, but enough to reach me," Daniel sighed. "And what are they saying? That you're saving a street girl? Some treat it as belated philanthropy, others as something less noble." Claire watched him intently. "And what is real?" Daniel thought for a moment. "It's someone who's hungry," he replied. "That's all." Claire didn't smile. She neither approved nor condemned. "Be careful," he simply said. "When people in power do something simple, the world always thinks there's a hidden agenda." The subplots intertwined without warning. A freelance journalist began investigating the original photo. A restaurant security guard was instructed to pay closer attention to external interactions. Maya realized she was being followed on more than one occasion. And Daniel felt for the first time that his two realities, the public and the private, were dangerously close to colliding. The pressure was mounting. Time was becoming a common enemy. Something needed to change, but none of the available options seemed safe. And at the heart of it all remained an unspoken question. To what extent could a seemingly small gesture drag two lives in directions neither of them controlled? The change came abruptly, as events that alter the course of history without asking permission often do. There was no clear warning, just a sequence of small decisions that, added together, created an impact impossible to ignore. Daniel received the call one Friday morning while preparing for a meeting with foreign investors. The number was unknown. Normally he would have ignored it. He answered on impulse. "Mr. Whitmore," said a professional, emotionless female voice. "This is from the city's Department of Social Services. We need to talk about a person associated with your name." The sentence left him motionless for a second. Minutes later, the meeting was postponed. Daniel left the building without giving detailed explanations, something unthinkable weeks before. On the way to the address provided, the city seemed different, narrower, closer, as if each block pushed him toward a reality he had been avoiding facing directly. Maya was arrested in the early hours of the morning, not for a serious crime, but for a common and cruel combination of factors: being in an inappropriate location, not carrying up-to-date documents, and resisting what was considered a standard approach. The resistance in this case was only verbal. Even so, it was enough. In the triage center, Maya remained seated in a metal chair, hands crossed, posture rigid. The atmosphere was cold, impersonal. There, personal stories held no weight, only records. When an employee mentioned Daniel Whitmore's name as a recurring contact, she looked up for the first time in hours. "I didn't give any name," he said firmly. "I didn't ask for help." The employee didn't respond. He simply wrote something down and moved on to the next step. Daniel arrived shortly after. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple coat and an expression that mixed irritation with something harder to define. He was led through narrow corridors to a room where Maya was waiting. When the door closed, there was an immediate silence. They stared at each other for a few seconds. There was no gratitude in her eyes, nor accusation, just weariness. "I didn't call you," she said, breaking the silence. "I didn't want it to turn into this." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." The revelation came next, without dramatization. Maya explained that she wasn't on the street simply due to bad luck or poor choices. There was a legal process underway in another state. A past she avoided mentioning because it always changed how people looked at her. A violent relationship, a poorly planned escape, a name different from the one she used now. That made her difficult to fit into standard programs. Daniel listened without interrupting. For the first time, he realized that his help, though well-intentioned, came with a comfortable ignorance. He had never asked. He never wanted to know too much. "You don't need to get involved," Maya concluded. "In fact, the less involved you are, the better for you." She didn't say it bitterly. She said it as someone stating a basic rule of reality. The impact was immediate. Daniel realized that this situation was neither temporary nor simple. It wasn't about offering food or momentary protection. Any step beyond that would require real choices with concrete consequences. Outside, while arranging Maya's provisional release, Daniel received another call. This time, from Richard. "This has gotten out of control," he said bluntly. "People are watching. If you continue to be associated with this, we're going to have serious problems." Daniel hung up without answering. When they finally left the building, the light rain had started to fall again. Maya adjusted her coat, preparing to leave alone. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "You can't go back out on the street today." She stared at him, assessing the situation. There was no relief in her expression, just a difficult decision. "Then don't make promises," she said. "Just do what you can handle." That sentence marked the true turning point. Not because something grand had happened, but because they both understood at the same time that the safe distance between their worlds had disappeared. From that point on, any choice would be irreversible. Daniel didn't take Maya to his apartment. The decision was almost instinctive, not out of lack of desire, but because he understood that certain boundaries once crossed couldn't be undone. Instead, he left her at a small hotel near Penn Station, one of those discreet places that survived amidst perpetual renovations and passing guests. He paid for 3 nights in advance, without explaining too much, without asking questions. "This isn't a plan," he said, handing over the room card. "It's just time." Maya nodded. Time, for her, had always been a rare luxury. That night, Daniel returned home with the uneasy feeling that his life had been shifted a few centimeters off axis. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The apartment was still immaculate, the silence intact, yet something had changed. He couldn't sleep. He thought about the choices he had made without realizing it, the decisions that now demanded continuity. The consequences began to manifest themselves quickly. The following Monday, Daniel was called to an extraordinary meeting with the fund's board. The tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an excessive caution in the words, a clear attempt to set boundaries. "We need to protect the institution," said one of the advisors. "And sometimes that means protecting you from yourself." Daniel listened, responded objectively, but left with the certainty that his room for maneuver was diminishing. Any further slip-up would be interpreted as a systemic risk. Maya, for her part, faced a different kind of consequence. The hotel room offered temporary safety, but it also brought to the surface memories she usually kept buried. The silence, the closed walls, the absence of constant surveillance. All of this kept her on edge. She slept little, sat near the door, and kept her backpack always ready. On the second day, she received an unexpected visit from a social worker assigned by the system. The conversation was cordial but perfunctory. Questions, forms, possibilities that always seemed conditional on something Maya couldn't offer. Prior stability. "You need a fixed address," the assistant said, writing something down. "Without it, it's difficult to move forward." Maya almost laughed. That circular requirement always haunted her. Meanwhile, rumors intensified. A financial blog published a vague note about the unpredictable behavior of a major investor. Nothing explicit, but enough to fuel speculation. Ellen Brooks tried to contain the damage, but the narrative was beginning to spiral out of control. Daniel was watched in every move. Any delay, any absence, any gesture outside the norm was recorded. On the third night, Maya called Daniel, not to ask for anything, just to let him know. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, "before this turns into something else I didn't choose." Daniel then realized that the help he had offered was not neutral. It had created invisible dependencies, fragile expectations. He tried to argue, but Maya was clear. "I don't want to be the problem you're trying to solve," she said. "I've been that for someone before." The reactions from both sides converged on an inevitable point. Continuing as they were was no longer possible. The simple gesture had transformed into a chain of effects that demanded a more profound decision, and time, once again, was pressing down. The following morning brought decisions that could no longer be postponed. Daniel woke up before his alarm, which was unusual. There was no meeting scheduled for that time, no urgent appointments on his calendar. Still, he felt the pressure of someone who knows that remaining still is also a choice, and almost always the worst one. Instead of going straight to the office, he cancelled his first appointments of the day. For the first time in years, he did so without over-explaining. He dressed simply and left without his driver. He walked a few blocks, blending into the city in a way he hadn't done since his youth. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a practical necessity, to think outside the structures that had always protected him. Daniel spent the morning talking to people he would normally delegate to others. He sought out a legal organization that worked with victims of interstate domestic violence. He spoke little about himself, focusing instead on understanding processes, deadlines, and real limitations. He discovered that helping wasn't just about offering resources, but about accepting that not everything could be accelerated with money. The transformation was not comfortable. Daniel found himself frustrated, annoyed, confronted by bureaucracies that ignored his last name. For the first time in a long time, he realized that his influence had well-defined boundaries. On the other side of town, Maya was also on the move. Before leaving the hotel, she left the room exactly as she had found it, not out of gratitude, but out of principle. She went to a community center recommended by the social worker and insisted on speaking with someone who could help her access a temporary shared housing program. It wasn't ideal, But it was a step forward. She accepted rules she would have previously refused, not because she trusted them, but because she was tired of running away from all the structures at once. When Daniel found her that afternoon, it wasn't by chance. She was sitting on the steps of the community center, backpack at her feet, her expression alert, but less withdrawn than before. He approached slowly, respecting her space. "I didn't come here to convince you of anything," he said, "just to do things differently than I did before." Maya watched him, assessing not his words but his posture. There were no promises, there was no hurry. He explained objectively what he had discovered, not miraculous solutions, but possible paths forward. He offered indirect legal support, contacts, time, without control, without explicit expectations. "You decide," he concluded. The change was subtle, yet decisive. Maya realized that, for the first time, someone wasn't trying to save her, to ease their own conscience. He was learning not to take up all the space. She accepted some of the help. She refused some of it. She set clear boundaries, and Daniel respected them. They both grew there, not through grand speeches, but through practical adjustments in behavior. He learned to act without dominating. She learned to accept support without disappearing into it. It wasn't a solution. It was real progress. The following weeks brought a deceptive sense of stability. Nothing exploded immediately. No new scandals emerged. Precisely for this reason, the tension grew denser. It was the kind of calm that precedes irreversible change. Daniel began operating at two distinct paces. In the corporate world, he maintained his usual demeanor, now with heightened caution. He kept to schedules, delivered results, and participated in strategic meetings as if nothing had happened. On the outside, everything seemed under control. On the inside, he no longer accepted the idea that absolute control was possible or desirable. The pressure increased when Richard Hale presented a seemingly reasonable proposal. Daniel should temporarily step away from the front line of the back line, assuming a more discreet role while the noise phase dissipated. "It's preventative," Richard said. "It's not punishment." Daniel understood the message. The institution was willing to protect him, but only up to a point. Accepting the leave of absence meant preserving his career. Refusing meant direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Maya faced her own race against time. The shared housing program offered only the first 30 days. To stay, she would need to submit complete documentation and initiate the pending legal process. The past she had avoided for so long now demanded direct confrontation. She began attending legal counseling sessions. Each meeting unearthed fragments of a story she preferred to keep buried. There was no catharsis, only exhaustion. Still, she continued. For the first time, she wasn't completely alone in this process, even if Daniel remained on the sidelines as they had agreed. Tensions between the two worlds resurfaced when a journalist finally made direct contact with Maya. Not aggressively, though. On the contrary, he was polite, patient, offering her a voice and visibility. She refused. But the denial didn't prevent the publication of a generic article about the invisible girl behind the investor. No explicit names, no direct accusations, just enough suggestions to rekindle public interest. Daniel found out about the story a few hours later. Ellen was direct. "This is going to escalate. Either you own the narrative, or someone else will do it for you." At the same time, Maya received a worrying warning. The man who had been watching her weeks before had been identified as someone connected to the news story. It wasn't a physical threat, but the risk of exposure was real. If his real name came to light, the legal proceedings would become public, and with that, the chances of rebuilding would decrease drastically. Their paths converged once more. Daniel needed to decide whether to accept a silent withdrawal, preserving everything he had built. Maya needed to decide whether to remain invisible or to take the risk of being seen with all the consequences. They both knew that the next choice would end the preparation phase. The fragile balance wouldn't hold for much longer. Something had to break. The breakup came at the most public moment possible. The fund's board scheduled a low-key press conference, the kind that doesn't usually attract much attention but carries important decisions between the lines. Daniel knew this would be his final opportunity to choose which narrative he would accept, the comfortable one or the truthful one. Richard made that clear minutes before they entered the room. "If you talk little, it will pass," he said. "If you talk too much, it becomes something else. There's no middle ground." Across town, Maya was watching the broadcast on an old computer at the community center. Not because she expected anything specific, but because she felt that moment concerned her as well. The documents scattered across the table reminded her that her own exposure hung by a thread. Daniel entered the room without notes. He sat down, listened to the initial questions, and answered about the market, investments, and institutional stability. Everything was as expected. Until a reporter asked bluntly, "Do you intend to comment on the rumors involving your relationship with a homeless woman?" Silence fell immediately. Richard lowered his gaze. Ellen held her breath. Daniel didn't ask for time. He didn't deviate. "Yes," he replied. The room was reconfigured in that instant. Recorders were adjusted, eyes locked. "There is no relationship in the terms that are being suggested," he continued. "There is a person. And there is a system that allows someone to go hungry just a few meters from where billion-dollar decisions are made. If that causes discomfort, perhaps that discomfort is necessary." He didn't name names. He didn't tell personal stories. He didn't portray himself as a hero. He simply rejected the convenient narrative. The impact was immediate and unpredictable. Some media outlets treated the statement as a rare ethical stance. Others interpreted it as emotional instability. The fund announced, a few hours later, Daniel's temporary leave of absence by mutual agreement. Meanwhile, Maya made her own decision. Upon realizing that the story was becoming public, she contacted her legal team. She authorized the formal commencement of the legal process in her real name. She did not give interviews. She did not appear in photos, but she stopped running away. The climax wasn't a dramatic encounter between the two. It was the simultaneous choice to act without hiding. When Daniel and Maya saw each other again days later, it was in a simple cafe, away from the cameras. There was no hug. There was no speech. "That changed everything," she said. "I know," he replied. "I don't know if it will work," Maya added. Daniel nodded. "Me either." And for the first time, this uncertainty didn't seem like a threat. The impact of the choices made at the climax did not dissipate quickly. On the contrary, it spread slowly and deeply, like waves that continue to expand even after the stone has already sunk. Daniel Whitmore went from a silent protagonist in the financial market to a figure debated in opinion columns. His temporary departure became permanent a few months later, officially due to strategic reorganization. Unofficially, it was clear that the board preferred to preserve the institution's predictability rather than coexist with someone who had introduced moral uncertainty into a comfortable system. He did not fight the decision. He used his time away from the market for something that had never been part of his plans, to truly understand how the mechanisms that had always been outside his field of vision worked. He began to finance smaller projects, not as distant philanthropy, but as an active, present investor, willing to listen to people who would never enter a boardroom. It wasn't a romantic transformation. It was practical, slow, sometimes frustrating, but real. The city ceased to be merely a predictable chessboard. It became a complex organism full of grey areas that could not be resolved with spreadsheets. Maya followed an even more difficult path. The legal process moved forward with the typical slowness of cases that don't warrant institutional urgency. There were postponed hearings, questioned documents, nights when the urge to give up almost won. Even so, she stayed. The housing program was extended. A temporary job became available through a social worker who, for the first time, didn't treat her like a statistic. There was no instant redemption. Maya remained distrustful, cautious, aware that the system hadn't changed just because she could now see it. But something essential had shifted. She was no longer invisible to herself. Contact between her and Daniel became sporadic. Objective messages, occasional updates, no promises of a shared future. The bond between them was never about romance or dependence. It was about the exact moment when two worlds touched and refused to pretend nothing had happened. The city remained indifferent. People still slept in the streets, restaurants still threw away food, millionaires still made decisions away from the sidewalks. But for Daniel and Maya, reality was no longer the same. They had crossed an invisible boundary, one beyond which it is no longer possible to return to life as before, even when everything around them insists on appearing the same. A year later, West 57th Street was still lit, elegant and indifferent. The restaurant was still open, the black sedan still parked there on some nights, albeit with other passengers. Maya no longer walked down that sidewalk. He lived in a small shared apartment in Queens, worked at a coffee shop, and studied at night. He still carried invisible scars, but now he had an address, a routine, and a choice. Daniel observed the city from a different angle. Less protected, less powerful, but more attentive. He never saw Maya at that exact spot again, and he knew that this, in itself, was a sign of change. Some stories don't end with certainties. They end with shifts. Stories like this aren't just about characters. They're about choices that often go unnoticed in everyday life. How many Mayas cross our paths unseen? How many Daniels believe that small gestures have no real consequences? If this story made you think, share your opinion in the comments. What has been the most memorable aspect of this unexpected journey for you? Your perspective can broaden this debate and reach other people. If you enjoy realistic, intense, and human stories like this one, subscribe to the channel to continue following narratives that provoke, move, and linger